Why would you form a nonprofit? And to get to that question, first we're going to kind of explain what a nonprofit is and what some of the core requirements of a nonprofit are. So the most common types of nonprofits fall within these two specific code sections of the Internal Revenue Code. And when you hear the term nonprofit, most frequently people are referring to a quote-unquote 501c3 organization. Another common one is 501c4, which is groups that are engaged in politics pretty heavily and in lobbying and things like that. So groups like Sierra Club often have a 501c4 as well as a 501c3, and their lobbying activities are done through the 501c4. Today we're going to focus more on 501c3 organizations. So the core requirements is that the nonprofit must be quote-unquote organized and operated exclusively, and exclusively is really the quotations, for exempt purpose. And I'll explain why I'm qualifying exclusively so much. The other requirements are no private benefit, no substantial lobbying, and no political activity. But a lot of activities that nonprofits do can influence public policy and not be considered lobbying or not be considered political activity. But if you take a stance on a candidate, for example, that's going to be political activity that's not allowed. The biggest requirement here is the no private benefit thing. And basically what that means is that you can't be taking in tax-deductible donations as a nonprofit and then just funneling that to private benefit in some way. But that doesn't mean that nonprofits can't pay their personnel a salary. It just has to be a quote-unquote reasonable salary. In some contexts, that can be a lot of money. So you think about a lot of nonprofit hospitals. Their CEOs make millions of dollars, and they're still a nonprofit, and there's no private benefit, apparently. So under the concept of organized exclusively for exempt purpose, this is basically provisions that have to be in your organizing documents, in your articles of incorporation, which say that you are going to be permanently dedicating your assets to an exempt purpose, and we'll get to what an exempt purpose is. In addition, you have to explain that you're going to limit your activities and not engage in political activities and things along those lines. So that's the organized part. Operated means what you actually do on a day-to-day basis. So operated, you see operated exclusively, but then must engage primarily in activities that accomplish exempt purposes. So what that means is that the vast majority of your work has to be in furtherance of these exempt purposes, and again, we'll explain what those are. And only an insubstantial part of your activities can be outside of that exempt purpose. But for example, if you are an organization that's promoting, pick your cause, promoting solutions to homelessness and providing education around homelessness. You could have a one-time fundraiser where you sell t-shirts that are not related to that just to raise money, and that would be an insubstantial part of the activities of the organization, and you wouldn't lose your tax-exempt status from just doing that one-time event. So I'll come back to that example as I explain more. So I keep mentioning exempt purposes. These come in a wide variety of flavors. Right here are a few of the main ones. And the primary exempt activities and exempt purposes that we see are educational and charitable. And there's all kinds of different rulings from the IRS around these, and there's publications that provide guidance on what charitable means, what education means. And then there's random, super specific things, like fostering amateur sports competition. So the NCAA is a nonprofit. The Olympics, I think, are in some way a nonprofit. And then there's other very specific things. But the kind of catch-all is charitable and educational. And so we're going to break those down a little bit. So I'm not going to read the slides. You can read them. But basically, charitable has these broad different categories which can encompass a lot of different activities that we would generally think of as philanthropic or benevolent in some way. And we'll give some examples of non-charitable activities or activities that have been rejected by the IRS when people have applied. Educational actually falls within charitable, but it has its own definitions too. And it's basically providing instruction either to individuals about some topic or to the general public. So a lot of organizations fall within educational, and actually a lot of activities that could be viewed as lobbying or influencing public policy could be viewed as educational. So, for example, my organization puts out a report that says if you don't address climate change, then we're going to have these catastrophic economic impacts. And those are circulated to all these legislators at the same time that climate change legislation is being considered in Congress. That would fall under educational.
So you're engaging the congressman?
Yeah, right. So exactly. So yeah, you're educating the congressman or the general public. You know, you're putting it out to the general public and targeting some individuals. So you can see that it's kind of on this spectrum, and the way that it goes is when you organize your nonprofit, you create your articles of incorporation, include those required clauses, and then you have to apply to the IRS for tax-exempt status. When you apply to the IRS, you basically explain what all of your planned activities are and make arguments for why you think it falls within these categories, and then they approve it or they disapprove it or they come back with questions. And that process can be a pretty extensive process, or it can be very cursory. It kind of depends on whose desk it lands on at the IRS, to be honest. A few, just to pick and choose a couple of these. Again, I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see the difference between where you cross over into private benefit. So if you look under charitable, doing work around low-income housing assistance can be considered charitable. But if you're building secure and sanitary housing for middle-income families, it's likely not considered charitable. And that's more of the type of activity that a normal for-profit organization would do. Similar under educational, you have museums that are educating the public about a topic of public interest. But if you have a private art gallery where you're selling artwork, that's not a nonprofit. That's not an exempt purpose that you're following. This starts to get, so with that background in mind, you start to get a picture of why you would choose a nonprofit versus another type of entity. So a few of the types of funding that you can get as a nonprofit are debt, so loans from banks. Nonprofits take out loans for operating capital, for payroll. They do lines of credit, things like that. And then most importantly, grants and donations. So nonprofits that are organized under Section 501c3 are, once they're approved by the IRS and the IRS says, yes, you're a tax-exempt organization, then donations that are provided to that organization are deductible from the taxes of the donor. So a lot of private foundations will only donate to nonprofits. In addition, nonprofits can generate revenue. So this is something that's often misunderstood. People think if I'm a nonprofit, I have to rely entirely on wealthy people to give me money. And that's not always true, or government to give me money. That's not always true. So in terms of revenue generation, there's a set of rules that basically says if what you're doing to generate revenue is related to your tax-exempt purpose, then that's okay. No issues there. But if what you're doing is unrelated to your exempt purpose, and it is routinely done or regularly carried on, then you would have what's called unrelated business income tax. And if you do too much of that activity, you could lose your tax-exempt status. So going back to the example of the organization that's educating people about homelessness, if you have a one-time t-shirt sales event, that would not be regularly carried on. Even though it's unrelated to your exempt purpose, it would not be regularly carried on. So you could do that, and you wouldn't have to pay unrelated business income tax, and your tax-exempt status wouldn't be in jeopardy. But if you run a business that sells t-shirts all the time, or every month you have that event for a long period of time, then that becomes regularly carried on, and you could lose your tax-exempt status. And we actually have an organization that had this sort of situation arise, and they had to spin off their revenue-generating arm, which was unrelated, into a separate for-profit business, which we'll talk about later how they are now able to relate to each other. Another important item to note is that just because you're exempt from income tax as a 501c3, sales tax is generally still required. So when you're selling those items, you still have to pay sales tax on them. So the reasons to form as a nonprofit, it really, I mean, the biggest thing for us when we're asked if you know, I have an organization that I'm planning on developing, should it be a nonprofit or a for-profit, the biggest impact is where is your money going to come from to run the organization. And if the answer is that it needs to come from charitable donations and from grants, if there's government grants that are available that are only going to go to nonprofits, or if there's private foundation money that only will go to nonprofits, then a nonprofit's likely the route. In addition, you obviously have to fit within one of these exempt purposes. But there's plenty of for-profit businesses that carry out those exempt type activities but are not nonprofits. So the exempt purpose is one piece of it, but it's not the whole picture. And in fact, because you have tax exempt status as a nonprofit, the public policy around it is that because the government is exempting you from taxes, you don't have to you don't have to go through that burden of paying taxes. There's tons of extra rules that apply. So in often cases, a for-profit may make more sense and give a lot more flexibility in terms of the activities that are available, but it could foreclose the opportunity to receive grants and donations if you think that would be a primary source of revenue for your business.